The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his protection officer, Detective Sergeant Michael Thompson. The boy's school bag hung loosely over his shoulder, and his polished shoes clicked softly against the stone pathway. Michael had been George's personal protection officer for 3 years now, and in that time, he had grown to admire the young prince's gentle nature and keen observations. George noticed everything, though he rarely spoke about what he saw. He observed how the palace staff hurried past with downcast eyes, how some of the newer guards seemed nervous in his presence, and how certain members of the household treated the security team with barely concealed disdain. The prince had learned early that his position came with invisible barriers that separated him from others, but he had also learned to see beyond those barriers to the people underneath. On this particular morning, something was different. Michael seemed quieter than usual, his usual cheerful greetings replaced with polite nods. George had noticed the change gradually over the past few weeks. The man who once shared stories about his daughter's football matches and laughed at George's jokes about his tutors now, walked with rigid shoulders, and spoke only when necessary. As they approached the main entrance where George's car waited to take him to school, the prince slowed his pace. He had been thinking about this moment for days, weighing his words carefully as his grandmother had taught him. The Queen had always told him that true leadership meant understanding when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to observe. "Michael," George said softly, stopping just short of the waiting vehicle, "you've been sad lately." The protection officer's step faltered slightly, surprised by the direct observation. He turned to look at the young prince, seeing not the future king but a child who had noticed his pain. Michael's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the exhaustion and hurt he had been carrying. "I'm fine, Your Royal Highness," Michael replied automatically, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. George studied his face with the same intensity he applied to his history lessons. He had learned to read people's expressions, to understand the difference between what they said and what they felt. His tutors called it emotional intelligence, but to George it was simply caring about the people around him. "You don't look fine," the prince said matter-of-factly, "and you haven't smiled properly in 2 weeks." The accuracy of the observation struck Michael deeply. He had indeed been struggling, caught between his duty to protect the young prince and the increasing pressure from certain palace officials who questioned his methods and background. Some had made it clear that they felt a working-class officer from Manchester wasn't suitable for such a prestigious position, regardless of his exemplary service record. George had overheard fragments of conversations, seen the subtle ways some staff members excluded Michael from discussions, noticed how certain protocol officers spoke to him differently than they spoke to others. The prince's young mind couldn't fully understand the complexities of class distinctions and institutional prejudice, but he understood unfairness when he saw it. "Sometimes grown-ups have difficult days," Michael said carefully, maintaining his professional demeanor even as he felt touched by the prince's concern. "My father says that when people are hurting, sometimes they need to know that someone cares," George replied, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. "I care about you, Michael. You're not just my protection officer, you're my friend." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than any royal proclamation. Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion. In his years of service, he had protected diplomats, politicians, and other members of the royal family, but none had ever acknowledged him as more than a necessary security measure. George reached into his school bag and pulled out a small envelope. He had written the letter the night before, working carefully by lamplight to ensure his handwriting was neat. The envelope bore no royal seal, no official markings, just his careful script spelling out Michael's name. "I wrote this for you," George said, extending the envelope. "You don't have to read it now, but maybe later when you have time." Michael accepted the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. The weight of the simple gesture struck him more powerfully than any commendation or official recognition he had ever received.
Here was a child who could have anything he wanted.
Yet he had taken time to write a personal note to his protection officer. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Michael said, his voice rougher than usual. "George," the prince corrected gently. "When it's just us, you can call me George. We're friends, remember?" As they completed the walk to the car, Michael felt something shift inside him. The letter remained unopened in his pocket, but its presence seemed to warm him from within. He had been questioning his place in this world of privilege and protocol, wondering if he truly belonged among the polished corridors and ancient traditions of the palace. The car door closed behind Prince George, and Michael watched through the window as the boy settled into his seat. George looked back and offered a small wave, not the formal acknowledgement expected of royalty, but the genuine gesture of a child saying goodbye to someone he cared about. During the drive to school, George stared out the window at the London streets thinking about the conversation. He had noticed the way Michael's eyes had brightened slightly when he called him a friend, had seen the careful way he held the letter. The prince understood that words had power, that sometimes a simple acknowledgement of someone's worth could change everything. Michael stood watching until the car disappeared from view, his hand unconsciously moving to the pocket containing George's letter. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope, a reminder of why he had chosen this profession in the first place. It wasn't about the prestige or the position. It was about service, about protecting those who mattered, about finding meaning in duty. As he turned to begin his other responsibilities for the day, Michael carried with him the memory of a 10-year-old prince who had seen beyond rank and protocol to recognize his humanity. The letter in his pocket felt like a promise, a reminder that kindness existed even in the most formal of worlds. That evening, after completing his homework and having dinner with his family, Prince George retreated to his bedroom. The palace felt different at night, quieter but somehow more alive with shadows and whispered conversations that carried through the long corridors. He sat at his desk, a piece of royal stationery before him, thinking about what he had witnessed that day. During his afternoon lessons, George had been distracted by thoughts of Michael. His French tutor had noticed his lack of attention, and his mathematics instructor had to repeat a problem 3 times before the prince responded. All day he had been processing the sadness he had seen in Michael's eyes, the careful way the man had accepted his letter, and the subtle changes he had observed in recent weeks. George was young, but he wasn't naive. Palace life had taught him to be observant, to notice the undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of formal interactions. He had seen how some staff members whispered behind Michael's back, how certain protocol officers excluded him from briefings, and how a few of the more traditional household members looked at him with barely concealed disapproval. The prince picked up his pen and began to write, choosing his words with the same care his grandfather Prince Philip had taught him to use when addressing important matters. The letter wasn't just a childhood gesture. It was a deliberate action taken by someone who understood the power of acknowledgement and respect. Meanwhile, across the palace complex, Michael sat in his small office reviewing security reports for the next day. The letter from Prince George lay open on his desk, its contents having moved him more than he cared to admit. The prince had written about noticing his sadness, about appreciating his service, and about considering him a valuable person beyond his professional duties. What struck Michael most wasn't just the kindness of the words, but their maturity. This wasn't a child's simple thank you note. It was a thoughtful reflection on human dignity and friendship. George had written about seeing him as more than just a security officer, about recognizing his efforts to make palace life feel normal and safe. The letter mentioned specific moments that had clearly stayed with the prince. The time Michael had helped him with a jammed locker at school, the afternoon he had patiently explained football rules during a long car journey, and the morning he had quietly handled a situation with an aggressive photographer without making George feel frightened. As Michael read the letter again, he thought about his own daughter Emma, who was just 2 years younger than Prince George. She often asked about his work, curious about what it was like to protect a future king. Michael had always focused on the professional aspects, but tonight, he realized that his job had become something more personal, more meaningful than he had initially understood. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Word had spread through certain circles within the palace about Prince George's gesture toward his protection officer. Not everyone viewed it positively. Lady Margaret Worthington, the deputy, master of the household, had heard about the letter through the intricate network of palace gossip and felt compelled to address what she saw as an inappropriate breach of protocol. Lady Margaret represented the old guard of palace traditions, believing firmly in the maintenance of proper boundaries between the royal family and their staff. In her view, Personal relationships between royals and their employees led to complications and compromised the dignity of the institution. She requested a meeting with Michael that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss security arrangements, but actually to address what she considered his overstepping of professional boundaries. Lady Margaret's office was impressive and intimidating, filled with portraits of previous monarchs and artifacts that spoke to centuries of royal tradition. "Detective Sergeant Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "It has come to my attention that you've been developing an inappropriately personal relationship with Prince George." Michael felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his professional composure. He had expected this conversation, had even dreaded it, but he wasn't prepared for how direct the accusation would be. "I've maintained appropriate professional standards at all times, ma'am," he replied carefully. Lady Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Prince George's education includes learning proper relationships with staff. Encouraging personal attachments undermines his preparation for his future role. The royal family must maintain appropriate distance from those in service positions." The words stung, because Michael understood their implication. He was being told, in polite but unmistakable terms, that his background and position made him unsuitable for genuine friendship with the young prince. The class distinctions that had shaped British society for centuries were being invoked to put him back in his proper place. "The prince is a kind child who notices when people around him are struggling," Michael said, choosing his words carefully. "I haven't encouraged anything inappropriate." "Perhaps not consciously," Lady Margaret conceded, "but your working-class background may not have prepared you for the subtleties required in this position. Prince George must learn that kindness and professional respect are different things entirely." The dismissive tone in her voice when she mentioned his background confirmed what Michael had suspected for weeks. Some within the palace hierarchy had never accepted his appointment, viewing him as an outsider who didn't belong in their rarefied world. As the meeting concluded with thinly veiled warnings about maintaining proper boundaries, Michael felt the weight of institutional pressure settling on his shoulders. He had faced physical danger in his previous assignments without hesitation, but this subtle campaign to undermine his position felt more threatening than any external security risk. That evening, Prince George noticed immediately that something had changed. Michael's demeanor had returned to the distant professionalism of their early days together. The easy conversations and shared moments of humor had disappeared, replaced by formal responses and careful distance. The prince said nothing during the car ride home from school, but his observant nature caught every detail of Michael's transformation. The man who had laughed at his stories just days before now responded with polite but detached acknowledgments. The warmth that had developed between them seemed to have evaporated overnight. As they walked through the palace corridors, George processed what he was seeing. Someone had spoken to Michael, had told him to step back, had reminded him of boundaries that the prince himself didn't fully understand or accept. The realization made George feel something he rarely experienced: anger at the unfairness of adult rules that seemed designed to prevent genuine human connection. That night, Prince George made a decision that would have consequences none of them could have predicted. The following week, Prince George implemented his plan with the careful precision his grandmother had taught him. The Queen had always emphasized that true power lay not in commands or demands, but in thoughtful actions that spoke louder than words. George understood that direct confrontation would only make things worse for Michael, so he chose a different approach entirely. It began subtly during his morning routine. When Lady Margaret appeared for her weekly protocol review with the prince, George greeted her with perfect courtesy, but maintained an emotional distance that was impossible to ignore. His responses to her questions about etiquette and proper behavior were technically correct, but delivered with a coolness that made her uncomfortable. "Your Royal Highness seems rather quiet today," Lady Margaret observed, attempting to understand the shift in the prince's demeanor. "I'm listening and learning," George replied politely, his words carrying no warmth. "You've taught me a lot about proper boundaries recently." The comment seemed innocent enough, but Lady Margaret detected something in the prince's tone that made her uneasy. There was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested he understood far more about recent events than anyone had realized. During his tutoring sessions, George's teachers noticed changes as well. He had always been an engaged student, asking questions and participating actively in discussions. Now, while he continued to excel academically, there was a reserve in his manner that hadn't existed before. Mr. Harrison, his history tutor, was particularly perceptive about the change. During a lesson about medieval monarchy, George asked pointed questions about the relationship between rulers and their protectors, about loyalty and class distinctions, about the cost of maintaining artificial barriers between people. Throughout history, George said during one session, the strongest monarchs were those who recognized the value of good people regardless of their birth. Weren't they? Mr. Harrison agreed, sensing there was more to the question than academic curiosity. The prince's inquiries seemed to be leading somewhere specific, though the tutor couldn't quite identify the destination. Meanwhile, Michael continued his duties with professional efficiency, but growing personal anguish. The distance he was forced to maintain from Prince George felt like a betrayal of the genuine connection they had developed. He watched the prince's subtle rebellion against palace protocols and recognized it for what it was: a 10-year-old's sophisticated protest against unfairness. The situation reached a turning point during a formal dinner, where several government officials were guests. Prince George, dressed impeccably and displaying perfect table manners, engaged the visitors in conversation with surprising maturity. When asked about his protection detail, the prince's response was measured but pointed. "Detective Sergeant Thompson is exceptional at his job," George said clearly, his voice carrying across the dining room. "He's intelligent, dedicated, and one of the finest people I've had the privilege to know. I hope our institution is wise enough to recognize and value such qualities." The comment, delivered with royal authority despite coming from a child, created a moment of thoughtful silence among the adults present. Several of the government officials exchanged glances, recognizing the implicit criticism of anyone who might question Michael's worth. Lady Margaret, present at the dinner, felt the weight of the prince's words and the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. She began to understand that her intervention had created a problem rather than solving one. Prince George was demonstrating a form of quiet leadership that was both impressive and concerning. After the dinner, Prince William approached his son privately. The Duke of Cambridge had noticed the tension in George's unusual behavior over the past week. As a father and future king himself, William understood the delicate balance between royal duty and human relationships. "George, I've noticed you've been different lately," William said, sitting beside his son in the palace library. "Is everything all right?" The prince looked at his father with serious eyes, weighing how much to share. He had learned that adults often made decisions they believed were protective, but that actually caused harm. The conversation with Lady Margaret about Michael had clearly fallen into that category. "Someone told Michael he couldn't be my friend anymore," George said simply. "They said it wasn't proper for someone like him to have a personal relationship with someone like me." William felt a flash of anger at hearing his son describe such class-based discrimination so matter-of-factly. The Duke had always been committed to modernizing the monarchy, to making it more accessible and human, and this situation represented exactly the kind of outdated thinking he wanted to change. "Who told you this?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I figured it out myself," George replied. "Michael started acting different after someone talked to him. He won't look me in the eye anymore, and he doesn't tell me about his daughter's football matches." The specificity of the observation struck William. His son wasn't just upset about losing a friend. He was recognizing and rejecting the institutional prejudices that had shaped royal life for generations. At 10 years old, George was already demonstrating the kind of emotional intelligence and moral clarity that would serve him well as a future king. "What do you think we should do about it?" William asked, curious to hear his son's perspective. George considered the question carefully. "I think good people should be treated with respect regardless of where they come from. And I think if we push away everyone who's genuine and kind, we'll end up surrounded only by people who tell us what they think we want to hear." The wisdom in those words struck William deeply. His son had identified one of the monarchy's greatest historical weaknesses: the tendency to become isolated from reality by layers of protocol and sycophancy. That evening, William requested a private meeting with Lady Margaret. The conversation was polite but firm, with the Duke making it clear that Prince George's emotional development and his ability to form genuine relationships with good people were more important than maintaining outdated class distinctions. The prince needs to learn that a person's character matters more than their background, William explained. Detective Sergeant Thompson has proven himself to be an exceptional officer and a positive influence on George. That should be what matters. Lady Margaret listened with growing discomfort, recognizing that her intervention had not only failed, but had created a larger problem. The Duke's message was clear. The monarchy was evolving, and those who couldn't adapt to its more inclusive vision would find themselves increasingly irrelevant. The next morning, Michael arrived at the palace expecting another day of careful distance and formal interactions. Instead, he was summoned to meet with Prince William, a request that filled him with both hope and apprehension. As he walked through the familiar corridors toward the Duke's office, Michael reflected on the past weeks of emotional turmoil. He had never imagined that protecting a royal child would become so personally meaningful, or that the simple act of caring about his charge would create such complications. What he didn't yet know was that Prince George's quiet rebellion had set in motion changes that would affect not just their relationship, but the broader culture within the palace walls. Michael stood outside Prince William's office, his heart beating faster than it had during any dangerous assignment he had ever undertaken. The formal summons had arrived without explanation, leaving him to wonder whether this meeting would end his career at the palace or somehow resolve the tension that had been building for weeks. When he entered, Prince William was standing by the window, looking out at the palace gardens where George often played football with his siblings. The Duke turned with a warm expression that immediately put Michael at ease, though questions still swirled in his mind. "Please sit down, Michael," William said, using the protection officer's first name in a way that suggested this would be a personal rather than formal conversation. "I wanted to speak with you about my son." Michael settled into the offered chair, maintaining his professional posture despite the informal tone. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Is there a security concern I should address?" "In a way, yes," William replied, taking the chair across from him. "But not the kind you might expect. George has been unhappy recently, and I believe it's connected to changes in your relationship with him." The directness of the statement caught Michael off guard. He had assumed that any concerns about his interactions with Prince George would result in disciplinary action, not a conversation about the boy's emotional well-being. "I've maintained appropriate professional boundaries," Michael said carefully, unsure how much to reveal about the pressure he had been under. William studied him with the same perceptive intelligence that characterized his son. "Michael, I know someone spoke to you about keeping distance from George. I also know that this conversation has affected both of you negatively." The relief Michael felt at hearing these words was overwhelming. For weeks, he had carried the burden of believing he had somehow overstepped his bounds, that his working-class background had indeed made him unsuitable for his position. "I never meant to create any complications," Michael said honestly. "Prince George is a remarkable young man, and I've grown to care about his well-being beyond just his physical safety." "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," William replied with a smile. "George needs people in his life who see him as more than just a future king. He needs genuine relationships with good people who will help him stay grounded and connected to the real world." The Duke leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "I want to be clear about something, Michael. Your background isn't a liability. It's an asset. George needs to understand people from all walks of life, and he needs to see that character and kindness matter more than titles or pedigree." Michael felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. The validation he was hearing contradicted everything Lady Margaret had implied about his unsuitability for the position. "I've spoken with the household staff about expectations and boundaries," William continued. "George values your friendship, and I want you to know that I support that relationship completely. You've been a positive influence on him, and I hope you'll continue to be." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with William sharing his vision for a more modern monarchy and his hopes for George's development as both a person and a future leader. Michael left the meeting feeling not just relieved but inspired, understanding that he was part of something larger than just personal protection. Later that afternoon, When Michael arrived to escort Prince George home from school, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The prince, who had been carefully polite but distant for over a week, looked up with hope in his eyes. "My father spoke with you," George said, not really asking a question. "He did," Michael confirmed, allowing warmth back into his voice. "And I owe you an apology for the past week. I was told to maintain distance, but I should have found a better way to handle the situation." "You don't need to apologize," George replied as they walked toward the car. "Adults made it complicated, not you." During the drive home, their conversation gradually returned to its previous ease. Michael asked about George's day, and the prince shared details about his classes and interactions with classmates. The natural friendship that had developed between them resumed as if the forced separation had never happened. "Can I ask you something?" George said as they neared the palace. "Of course. Why do some people think your background makes you less suitable for this job? You're better at understanding people than most of the officials I meet." The question demonstrated the prince's remarkable perception and his ability to identify the real issues underlying recent events. Michael considered how to answer honestly without being inappropriate about palace politics. "Some people believe that positions like mine should only go to people from certain backgrounds," Michael explained carefully. "They think that education and experience matter less than family history or social class." "That's stupid," George said with characteristic directness. "Good people are good people regardless of where they come from." "I agree," Michael replied, touched by the prince's moral clarity. "And I think your generation of leaders will do better at recognizing that." That evening, Prince George's mood was noticeably brighter during family dinner. Princess Catherine commented on the change, and George simply said that he was happy because a friend was feeling better. The simplicity of the explanation masked the sophisticated understanding of human relationships that had driven his recent behavior. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret was experiencing her own period of reflection. The Duke's conversation with her had been polite, but unmistakably clear about the direction the royal household was taking. She began to understand that her traditional approach to palace hierarchy was becoming obsolete. Over the following days, subtle changes rippled through the palace staff. Word spread about Prince William's support for Detective Sergeant Thompson, and the message was clear: competence and character were valued over social pedigree. Several other staff members who had felt marginalized by class-based discrimination began to feel more secure in their positions. Prince George noticed these changes too. The whispered conversations that had excluded Michael gradually ceased, and he observed greater respect being shown to protection officers and other working-class staff members. His quiet rebellion had achieved more than he had initially hoped for. 1 week after his father's intervention, George approached Michael with another letter. This one was shorter but no less meaningful. "I wanted to thank you for being my friend even when it was difficult," the letter read. "You showed me that good people stand by their principles even under pressure. That's a lesson worth learning." As Michael read the note, he realized that his role in Prince George's life had evolved beyond protection into mentorship. He was helping to shape not just the prince's understanding of security and safety, but his character and his vision of what leadership could be. The experience had taught them both valuable lessons about loyalty, integrity, and the courage required to maintain authentic relationships in a world full of artificial constraints. For Prince George, it was an early lesson in using his position to protect and support good people, rather than simply accepting unfair traditions. For Michael, it was a confirmation that his instincts about the importance of genuine human connection had been correct all along. The bond he had formed with the young prince was exactly what both of them needed, and no amount of institutional pressure could diminish its value. 3 months after the resolution of the boundary crisis, Prince George and Michael had settled into a comfortable rhythm that balanced friendship with professional responsibility. Their relationship had become a model within the palace for how genuine respect could coexist with appropriate protocol. However, neither of them anticipated the challenge that would test their bond in an entirely different way. The crisis began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in November. Michael had arrived early for his shift, as was his custom, reviewing the day's schedule and security briefings in his small office. The routine intelligence reports included the usual mixture of low-level threats, public event details, and diplomatic considerations that were part of protecting any high-profile individual. What caught his attention was a notation about increased activity among certain anti-monarchy groups, particularly those with grievances about police and security services. The intelligence was vague but suggested the possibility of demonstrations or disruptions during Prince George's upcoming public appearances. Michael had dealt with protest groups before and knew that most posed no real physical threat. However, his training had taught him to take all potential risks seriously, especially when they involved a child under his protection. He made note of the intelligence and planned to coordinate with the broader security team about additional precautions. Meanwhile, Prince George was experiencing his own challenges that week. His school had organized a special project about social justice and inequality, topics that resonated deeply with the young prince given his recent experiences with class discrimination. George had chosen to research the relationship between police services and working-class communities, partly inspired by his friendship with Michael. During his research, George discovered uncomfortable truths about how some communities viewed police officers with suspicion and distrust. He read about incidents where working-class families felt unfairly treated by authorities, and about the complex relationship between law, enforcement, and social justice. The prince found himself in an unusual position of trying to reconcile his admiration for Michael with the broader criticism of police institutions that appeared in his research materials. It was his first real encounter with the complexity of social issues that couldn't be resolved through simple friendship or good intentions. "Michael," George said during their car ride to school that Wednesday, "do you think some people don't trust police officers because of bad experiences?" The question caught Michael off guard, both because of its sophistication and because it touched on issues he had wrestled with throughout his career. He had joined the police force to serve and protect, but he wasn't naive about the problems within law enforcement institutions. "That's a complicated question, George," Michael replied thoughtfully. "Some people have had negative experiences with police officers who didn't treat them fairly. Others have been let down by a system that didn't protect them when they needed help. But you're not like that," George said with certainty. "I try not to be," Michael answered honestly. "But I'm part of an institution that has sometimes failed people, especially those from backgrounds like mine. That's something I think about every day." The conversation continued over several days, with George asking increasingly complex questions about justice, fairness, and the responsibility of institutions to serve all people equally. Michael found himself impressed by the prince's ability to grapple with nuanced social issues without losing his fundamental sense of right and wrong. Unknown to both of them, these philosophical discussions were taking place against the backdrop of escalating tension within certain activist groups. Intelligence reports suggested that Prince George's upcoming visit to a youth center in East London had attracted the attention of protesters who viewed the royal family as symbols of an unjust social order. The youth center visit was particularly meaningful to George because it represented his first major solo public engagement. He had specifically requested to visit organizations that worked with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, wanting to understand how his future role as king could make a positive difference in their lives. On Friday afternoon, Michael received a more detailed briefing about the potential security risks surrounding the youth center visit. The intelligence suggested that while no specific threats had been made against Prince George personally, the event might attract protesters who opposed the monarchy and could potentially create dangerous situations. The senior security team recommended canceling or significantly scaling back the visit, arguing that the risks outweighed the benefits of a 10-year-old prince making such a public appearance in a potentially hostile environment. Michael found himself in a difficult position. His primary responsibility was ensuring Prince George's safety, and the intelligence report suggested genuine risks. However, he also understood how important this visit was to the prince, who had been preparing for weeks and was excited about meeting young people who shared some of his interests and concerns. That evening, Michael made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Instead of simply accepting the security team's recommendation to cancel the visit, he requested a private meeting with Prince William to discuss alternative approaches that might allow the event to proceed safely. "Your Royal Highness," Michael said during their meeting. I believe Prince George's visit to the youth center is important, enough to warrant finding creative security solutions rather than simply canceling. William listened as Michael outlined his concerns about the intelligence reports while also explaining why he thought the visit should proceed. The protection officer's recommendation was to increase security presence but allow the prince to engage authentically with the young people at the center. You're willing to take additional personal risk to make this visit happen, William observed. I believe Prince George needs experiences that connect him with real people facing real challenges, Michael replied. Keeping him in a protective bubble won't prepare him for his future responsibilities. The Duke appreciated Michael's perspective, recognizing that the protection officer understood both the security considerations and the broader implications of the prince's development as a future leader. However, Michael's recommendation created tension with other members of the security team, who felt he was prioritizing the prince's personal development over proper safety protocols. Some questioned whether his friendship with George was affecting his professional judgment. Commander Sarah Walsh, the head of Royal Protection Services, called Michael into her office the following Monday morning. Her expression was serious as she addressed what she saw as a concerning pattern in his decision-making. Detective Sergeant Thompson, she began formally, your recommendation regarding the youth center visit suggests you may be allowing personal considerations to influence your professional judgment. Michael felt a familiar sinking sensation, recognizing that his advocacy for the prince's authentic engagement with the public was being interpreted as compromised judgment. My recommendation is based on my assessment of what Prince George needs for his development as a future leader, Michael replied carefully. Your job is to keep him safe, not to make decisions about his character development, Commander Walsh responded sharply. The intelligence report suggests significant risks, and you're recommending we proceed anyway. The meeting continued for 30 minutes, with Michael defending his position while facing increasingly pointed questions about his objectivity and professional priorities. By the end, he understood that his future with the Royal Protection Service was in jeopardy. What made the situation particularly painful was the realization that his genuine care for Prince George's well-being was being used as evidence against his professional competence. The same personal investment that had made him an effective protector was now being characterized as a liability. That afternoon, as Michael escorted Prince George home from school, the prince immediately sensed something was wrong. The man who had been increasingly relaxed and open over recent months had returned to the tense demeanor that had characterized their relationship during the earlier crisis. Someone's upset with you again, George observed with his characteristic directness. Michael nodded, unwilling to lie to the perceptive young prince. There's disagreement about how to handle security for your youth center visit. Prince George studied his protector's face, recognizing the signs of stress and professional pressure that he had learned to identify. The prince realized that once again, his own actions and desires were creating problems for someone he cared about. That evening, Prince George made a decision that demonstrated the emotional maturity he had developed through his relationship with Michael. Instead of immediately involving his father or attempting another quiet rebellion, the prince chose to gather information and understand the full scope of the situation before taking action. He began by carefully listening to conversations around the palace, using the observation skills that had served him well in previous situations. George learned that the security concerns about his youth center visit were serious, involving potential protesters and anti-monarchy groups who might view his appearance as provocative. However, he also discovered that Michael's recommendation to proceed with enhanced security, rather than canceling the visit, had created professional problems for his protection officer. Several senior officials questioned whether Michael's judgment was compromised by his personal relationship with the prince. The complexity of the situation troubled George deeply. He understood that Michael was facing professional consequences for advocating on his behalf, but he also recognized that the security concerns were legitimate and needed to be taken seriously. On Wednesday morning, George approached his father with a request that surprised Prince William, with its thoughtfulness and strategic thinking. I want to meet with Commander Walsh and the security team about my youth center visit, George announced during breakfast. That's not necessary, George, William replied. These are operational security matters that adults need to handle. But it's my visit and people are having problems because of decisions about what I should or shouldn't do, George insisted. I think I should understand what's happening and maybe help find a solution. William studied his son's serious expression, recognizing the same determination that had characterized George's previous interventions in palace politics. The Duke realized that his son was developing a sophisticated understanding of leadership that went beyond simply accepting decisions made by others. What exactly do you want to accomplish in this meeting? William asked. I want to understand the real risks, and I want to make sure Michael doesn't get in trouble for caring about my development as a person, George replied with startling directness. The honesty of the response convinced William that his son was ready for a more adult conversation about the complexities of royal duty and security considerations. That afternoon, an unusual meeting took place in the palace's security conference room. Prince George, accompanied by his father, sat across from Commander Walsh, Michael, and 2 other senior protection officers. The 10-year-old prince's presence in such a setting was unprecedented, but his calm demeanor suggested he understood the seriousness of the occasion. Your Royal Highness, Commander Walsh began, unsure how to address security matters with such a young audience. We appreciate your interest in these arrangements, but security decisions require adult judgment about risks you might not fully understand. I understand that people might protest my visit because they don't like the monarchy, George replied matter-of-factly. I also understand that some people have had bad experiences with police and government institutions that make them angry. The directness and accuracy of George's assessment surprised the security officials, who had expected to deal with a child's naive enthusiasm rather than informed political awareness. Given that understanding, George continued, I want to know if there are ways to make the visit work that address the security concerns while still allowing me to meet with young people who might benefit from seeing that the royal family cares about their communities. Commander Walsh exchanged glances with her colleagues, recognizing that the prince's question was both sophisticated and reasonable. His approach suggested genuine consideration of competing interests rather than simple insistence on getting his way. Michael watched the interaction with growing admiration for the young prince's diplomatic skills. George was demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership qualities that Michael believed were essential for a future king: the ability to listen to different perspectives and find solutions that addressed multiple concerns. The intelligence report suggests significant risks of disruption and possible violence, Commander Walsh explained, providing more detail than she had initially planned. Anti-monarchy groups have been coordinating online about your visit, and some have histories of aggressive confrontation with authority figures. What if we change the format? George suggested. Instead of a public appearance that might attract protesters, what if I met with smaller groups of young people in a more controlled setting? The suggestion demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed everyone in the room. The prince was proposing a compromise that might achieve his goals while addressing the security team's concerns. We could organize multiple smaller visits to different youth organizations, Prince William added, building on his son's idea. That would reduce the visibility that attracts protesters while still allowing meaningful engagement. Over the next hour, the group developed a modified plan that incorporated enhanced security measures with the kind of authentic engagement George had wanted. The prince would visit 3 smaller youth organizations over several weeks, with each visit carefully planned to minimize security risks while maximizing meaningful interaction. What impressed Michael most was George's willingness to accept limitations and modifications to his original plan in order to address legitimate concerns. The prince showed no resentment about the security restrictions, instead focusing on how to accomplish his goals within the necessary constraints. As the meeting concluded, Commander Walsh approached Michael privately. The conversation that followed marked a significant shift in how his advocacy for the prince was perceived within the security services. Detective Sergeant Thompson, she said, I owe you an apology. Your recommendation to find creative solutions rather than simply canceling the visit was correct. Prince George's mature approach to this situation demonstrates that your understanding of his character development needs was accurate. The acknowledgement meant more to Michael than any formal commendation could have. His professional judgment was being validated by the same people who had questioned it just days earlier. "The prince has taught me as much as I've taught him," Michael replied honestly. His ability to balance idealism with pragmatism is remarkable for someone his age. Over the following weeks, the modified youth center visits proved to be tremendously successful. Prince George's interactions with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds were genuine and meaningful, while the enhanced security measures prevented any significant disruptions. More importantly, the process of developing these solutions had strengthened the working relationship between Michael and the broader security team. His advocacy for the prince's authentic engagement was now seen as valuable strategic thinking rather than compromised judgment. Prince George's handling of the situation had also elevated his status within the palace hierarchy. Senior officials began to recognize that the young prince possessed genuine leadership qualities that went beyond good manners and protocol adherence. The experience taught George important lessons about negotiation, compromise, and the art of finding solutions that addressed multiple competing interests. He learned that effective leadership often required accepting limitations while finding creative ways to achieve important goals. For Michael, the episode confirmed that his approach to protection, considering the prince's long-term development alongside immediate safety concerns, was not only appropriate, but essential. His willingness to advocate for George's growth as a leader had been vindicated by the successful outcome. However, neither of them anticipated that their strengthened partnership would soon face its most severe test, one that would challenge everything they had learned about loyalty, duty, and the true meaning of protection. The final test of their relationship came 6 months later, in a way that neither Prince George nor Michael could have anticipated. It began with a phone call that Michael received at home on a Sunday evening, informing him that his daughter Emma had been seriously injured in a car accident and was being rushed to Manchester Royal Infirmary. The call shattered Michael's world in an instant. Emma, who was just 8 years old, had been crossing the street near their home when a distracted driver ran a red light. She was unconscious and in critical condition, with doctors uncertain about the extent of her injuries or her chances for recovery. Michael's first instinct was to drive immediately to Manchester to be with his daughter, but duty and protocol required him to arrange coverage for his protection responsibilities before leaving London. The conflict between his personal crisis and his professional obligations created an agonizing dilemma. As he made frantic phone calls to organize replacement security coverage, Michael's emotional composure began to crack. The man who had faced dangerous situations with calm professionalism found himself struggling to think clearly about routine scheduling arrangements. "Prince," George noticed immediately that something was terribly wrong when Michael arrived for his Monday morning duties. The protection officer's face was pale and drawn, his usual alertness replaced by distracted anxiety that was impossible to conceal. "Michael, what's happened?" George asked with immediate concern, recognizing signs of genuine distress in someone he had learned to read with remarkable accuracy. "My daughter was in an accident," Michael replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "She's in the hospital in Manchester and I need to arrange coverage so I can be with her." The words hit Prince George like a physical blow. He had heard Michael talk about Emma countless times, sharing stories about her football matches, her school achievements, and her curious questions about his work protecting a prince. George had come to think of Emma almost like a younger sister he had never met. "Is she going to be okay?" George asked, though he could see from Michael's expression that the answer was uncertain. "I don't know," Michael admitted, abandoning his usual professional reserve. "The doctors aren't sure yet about the extent of her injuries." Prince George's reaction was immediate and decisive. "You need to go to her right now. Don't worry about coverage or schedules or anything else." "I can't just leave my duties," Michael protested weakly, though every fiber of his being wanted to do exactly that. "Yes, you can," George replied with the authority of someone who understood that some things mattered more than protocol. "Your daughter needs you, and that's more important than anything else." The prince's words carried emotional weight that cut through Michael's professional training. Here was a 10-year-old boy demonstrating the kind of moral clarity that adults often lost in the complexity of competing obligations. George immediately approached his father, who was working in his office, and explained the situation with characteristic directness. Prince William's response was swift and unequivocal. "Tell Michael to go to Manchester immediately. William instructed. We'll handle security arrangements. His daughter is the priority right now. When George delivered this message to Michael, the protection officer felt overwhelmed by the generosity and understanding he was receiving. The royal family was releasing him from his duties without question or hesitation, recognizing that his personal crisis took precedence over everything else. As Michael prepared to leave for Manchester, Prince George made a request that surprised everyone involved. I want to come with you, the prince announced. George, that's not possible, Michael replied gently. This is a family emergency and you have your own responsibilities here. Emma is your family and you're my friend, George said with simple logic. Sometimes friends need to be together during difficult times. The request created immediate complications for security planning and royal protocol, but George's determination was absolute. He had made up his mind that Michael shouldn't face this crisis alone, and no amount of adult reasoning could dissuade him. After rapid consultations between palace security and the Duke of Cambridge, an unprecedented decision was made. Prince George would accompany Michael to Manchester, with additional protection, officers and careful coordination with local authorities to ensure security while allowing the prince to provide emotional support to his friend. The drive to Manchester was unlike anything in Michael's experience as a protection officer. Instead of the usual formal dynamic between royal and security personnel, the car felt like a space shared by two people facing a crisis together. George asked thoughtful questions about Emma's condition and shared stories designed to distract Michael from his worst fears. Emma sounds like someone who's really strong, George said during the journey. Strong people find ways to get better, even when things seem scary. The simple observation, delivered with complete sincerity, provided Michael with more comfort than any adult platitude could have offered. George's presence transformed what would have been an agonizing solitary journey into something bearable. At the hospital, the unprecedented sight of a young prince visiting a critically injured working-class child created considerable attention among staff and other patients. However, George's behavior was so natural and appropriate that the unusual nature of his presence quickly faded into the background. Emma was unconscious when they arrived, connected to monitors and breathing apparatus that made her seem impossibly small and fragile. Michael's composure finally broke completely when he saw his daughter, and he wept with the raw emotion of a parent facing every parent's worst nightmare. Prince George stood quietly beside Michael, offering the kind of solid, supportive presence that transcended age and social position. He didn't attempt to offer false reassurance or empty comfort, instead simply being present during an impossible moment. Over the next 3 days, George remained in Manchester despite palace officials' attempts to convince him to return to London. He had made his decision based on loyalty and friendship, and he refused to abandon Michael during the most difficult period of his life. The prince's vigil at the hospital had profound effects that extended far beyond the immediate situation. News of his presence spread throughout the hospital and the broader Manchester community, creating a powerful symbol of compassion that crossed class and social boundaries. When Emma finally regained consciousness on Thursday morning, her first coherent words were a whispered question about why there was a prince sitting beside her father. The gentle humor in her observation broke the tension that had consumed everyone for days. I'm George, the prince replied simply. Your dad is my friend and I wanted to make sure you were okay. Emma's recovery was slow but steady, and her resilience impressed everyone involved in her care. Michael later credited Prince George's presence during those critical days as essential to his ability to cope with the crisis. The experience fundamentally changed the relationship between the prince and his protection officer. What had begun as professional duty had evolved through friendship into something approaching family loyalty. They had faced a genuine crisis together and emerged with bonds that transcended their official roles. For Prince George, the Manchester Hospital vigil was a formative experience that taught him about the true meaning of leadership and service. He learned that real power lay not in commanding others but in standing beside people during their darkest moments. When they finally returned to London, Michael submitted his resignation from the Royal Protection Service. The emotional intensity of recent events had convinced him that his feelings for Prince George and his family had grown beyond what was appropriate for a professional relationship. However, Prince George's response to the resignation letter demonstrated the full extent of his growth as both a person and a future leader. In a private meeting with his father, the prince made an argument that would reshape royal protection policies for years to come. If we only want protection officers who don't care about us personally, we'll end up with people who are just doing a job, George explained to Prince William. Michael cares about me and that makes him better at protecting me. Not worse. The wisdom in this observation led to Michael's resignation, being rejected and his position being redefined to acknowledge that personal loyalty and professional competence could coexist effectively. The experience established new precedents for how the royal family approached relationships with their security personnel. Years later, when Michael would tell the story of his time protecting Prince George, he would always emphasize that the prince had taught him more about courage, loyalty, and leadership than he had ever taught the future king. Their relationship had begun with a simple act of kindness and grown into something that changed both of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The quiet but firm actions of a 10-year-old prince had not only protected a friend, but had helped modernize an ancient institution, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest recognition of human dignity and worth.